You can get really creative with virtual reality. A friend of mine ran a study where she wanted to look at attachment style and how people with different attachment styles responded to a partner's presence or absence when they were doing a scary task. And the scary task was walking across this tiny little beam of wood in virtual reality over a giant chasm, and the partner was either at the other side or the partner was not at the other side in this virtual world. And she looked at people's behaviors and their emotional experiences and their cognitions during the process, and how attachment affected those, and how it affected those differently depending on whether they could see the partner or not see the partner. So you can be creative and measure things that in the lab you might have to use much more mundane situations and mundane measures. She got findings that absolutely mapped onto the other findings in the attachment literature.
Wow.
And people reported that it was very scary when they did fall off at the piece of wood or whatever, that they would curl up and really felt like they were falling.
Another benefit involves the trade-off that researchers have traditionally been confronted with between experimental control and ecological validity, which is the extent to which findings can generalize to real-life settings. Most experiments are conducted in contrived artificial laboratories in order to maximize control over stimuli, but this sacrifices ecological validity. However, for the first time, IVE presents a way to provide high ecological validity without compromising experimental control.
I do have a colleague who did a very interesting study about the classic trolley problem in philosophy, where you have to make a choice as to if you're familiar with the trolley problem, the train or trolley is coming down the tracks, and somebody's standing at a switch, they can divert the train, and if they don't divert the train, it'll kill 5 people that are working on the train tracks. And if they pull the switch, it'll divert the train and kill 1 person. And people have been asked in surveys about what they would do, but the problem is sometimes what people say they'll do is different from what they would actually do in the situation. And of course, ethically, we can't run the trolley problem with an experiment. So what he did, he created a virtual reality scenario. His name, by the way, is Dr. David Navarrete, and if anybody wants to look up the study. In real time, we're presented with this, and they had to make a very quick decision as to what they were going to do, and the sound effects were quite realistic as to what happened when the train hit the people. That's not funny, but that's an example of virtual reality research. I expect to see much more of that in the future.
Yeah.
So this article discusses prominent challenges when using VR for psychological research and solutions to them. One of these challenges is that of self-embodiment. When a participant puts on a VR head-mounted display, they no longer see their body, which you can see an example of in this clip. It may seem that in most contexts this doesn't matter, but there's actually evidence that a lack of embodiment can worsen performance on a variety of tasks that make use of the self-image, for example, mental rotation. Another challenge is that of the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley refers to the valley on a graph, which you can see here, on which the x-axis is human likeness and the y-axis is our empathic response to this being, or how comfortable we are perceiving it. And you'll see there's a sharp drop in how we react to beings that are just shy of full human likeness. Studies show that still images like this one, morphed between a human and robot appearance, trigger the uncanny valley, but less so when it moves. It suggested that uncanniness arises when there is a discrepancy between a character's appearance and how it moves, and this suggests that the key to creating believable virtual characters is smooth, realistic motion, and also avoiding highly realistic virtual characters. And another challenge is that many users experience nausea or simulation sickness while using VR. This is due to a conflict between the visual and vestibular systems when the user perceives they're moving with their eyes, but not with their body, which is the opposite of motion sickness from a car. A simple fix to this is physical navigation, in which the user can move around a large space that's on the same scale as the virtual world, referred to as room scale VR.
And the VR companies who make this are going to become the largest data companies in the world, because in order to have your avatar in the VR in real time, you have to capture so much of our behavior that we're going to be capturing behavior that's expensive to capture outside in the real world, but it's going to be very cheap to capture in VR. And the companies that are running these, they're not making the money selling goggles. They're going to be collecting our lives' data, and that's going to be their wealth.
So this is a tricky issue because if you have a ton of data and a very large sample set from this data that's very easy to obtain, everything ends up significant. So that actually puts a burden on the researcher to have a really good theoretical basis for their hypotheses, because otherwise you run the analyses and things that are pretty meaningless may end up significant, and you have to then cull through the data and decide, okay, what is worth paying attention to in here. So I think it'll put a burden on researchers in that way.
You know, one of the criticisms of psychology is that the research is based really on American college freshmen. We know a lot about college freshmen, but whether that generalizes to other people and to other geographic locations and so on is the question. So I expect to see the use of technology to facilitate much more massive scale research, where instead of having 100 or 200 subjects, you have thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands from different locations around the world. And we can differentiate then traits that humans have from an evolutionary perspective, of course, where that are probably evolved adaptations and human universals that you see around the world, and what is more variable, maybe a byproduct of adaptations, or more what we call facultative adaptations.
This APS article looks into the ways that new big data is changing psychological research. The amount of digital data in existence when this article was written in 2014 was estimated to be in the thousands of exabytes. The article suggests that we might even get to a point where researchers don't need to sample human participants at all. Already, our smartphones can continuously collect information on physical activity, social interactions, geographic location, and more, as you can see here. This doesn't require participants' time or energy and drastically reduces errors from self-report.
I also think it will allow us to get at some of the everyday social behaviors that people engage in. Of course, as a social psychologist, I'm interested in the social behaviors. We've been using, as social psychologists, we've been using social media for years to look at people's responses to real life social interactions, or real on phone social interactions.
There are massive data sets that are available to researchers. For example, OkCupid has a data set that's available to researchers with tens of thousands of people's dating profiles. I presume it's been anonymized. I hope it has been. And I downloaded it. I haven't done anything with it, but Facebook has been used, as is in the news recently, legitimately and non-legitimately, to do massive studies on people. And there's a lot of ethical questions involved, a lot of ethical questions about privacy and giving consent. I don't think the people on OkCupid or Facebook really gave consent to be involved in research, even if it's been anonymized. To what extent can sometimes that not work properly?
Facebook right now having accessed a lot of information that people were not aware they were accessing, even though people had given them the permission. So technically, Facebook can say, well, you clicked this box and said we have permission to access this information from your cell phone. People weren't very aware. I think our research protocols are much more stringent than what Facebook was operating from, which is too bad because Facebook was working with a research firm who should have had similar protocols. But I think at least in academia and many other organizations, hopefully all other organizations that collect human data, that we have an IRB. Our IRB would not let something like that pass without ensuring that participants were aware. So I do worry that it could be abused. It has been abused, but I do have confidence that most researchers are ethical and wouldn't abuse it and would get true informed consent.
I think there will be for quite a long time, but I don't know how long is. I don't know if it's 5 years or 10 years or 20 years.
So maybe I'm just not very creative or optimistic, but I can't imagine not having the level of flexibility that a human provides in the studies that we run. So you well know how much interaction there is in the studies that we run. You are interacting with the participant over the course of at least an hour in a lab setting. You're hooking them up to physio equipment. You are answering questions. You're setting them up on surveys. You're possibly videotaping depending on the study. And having to be flexible and responsive, especially because in our studies we may have some degree of deception and you're giving them information that may not be true, and then they may have follow-up questions or they may question it and get a little bit suspicious, and you need to alleviate their suspicions. And I don't know that AI would be up to the task of dealing with all of that. In the future, if it was, that would be amazing, but then I would still worry about the ethical element of it. The AI would have to be pretty darn sophisticated to be able to tell if a participant was getting distressed, and then discontinue this, make the decision to discontinue the study. So for ethical reasons and for reasons of wanting to preserve the quality of data, I wouldn't move in that direction myself until I was really confident that this AI was operating at a level similar to a human being, and at a level similar to a human being in terms of being able to read other people and respond flexibly.
Yeah, AI is already being used by IBM's Watson for medical research and medical diagnosis. And it's available to other businesses. I think you may be aware that IBM's Watson beat the best Jeopardy players, which is a stunningly difficult task.
Now we come to Watson. We're looking for Bram Stoker, and we find who is Bram Stoker, and the wager. Hello, 17,973, 41,413, and a two-day total of 77,147.
There's pros and cons. I mean, I think Watson is being used now for making diagnoses better than physicians can make diagnoses, and psychologists and psychiatrists. And they will be able to mine Watson will be able to mine massive data sets to find relationships that researchers haven't found. And and then there's the problem of moving toward computers that are more intelligent than we are, and the problems that might present for us.
So I feel like in the current state of things, effective computing is probably not very accurate. I feel like based on our physiology, you would have to collect information on a lot of different markers to really pick up on a discrete emotion. So certain markers might indicate several emotions. So, heart rate variability plus blood pressure plus, let's say, other cardiovascular measures related to the output of blood from the heart, etc., might all map onto 5 different, positive or negative emotions. So I feel like affective computing is a little bit crude right now, until we have better identified the sequence of markers that truly represent a discrete emotion, not a variety of emotions. Because affective computing in responding to what could be anger or anxiety or a variety of negative emotions will not be giving a very useful response. It's going to be too broad.
I think computers in the very near future will be able to read our emotions on our facial expressions, and robotics will have facial expressions, which will open up a whole new world that I cannot even imagine. And I think, quite frankly, it has some really fundamental philosophical, even existential questions about our relationships with other people, and to what extent in the future virtual relationships will be far more satisfying than real relationships, because real relationships are messy and difficult, and robotics in the future could be programmed to really be your best friend. Far more of a BFF than your current BFF.
The MIT Media Lab Effective Computing Group exclusively utilizes effective computing in a multitude of research projects, some of which you can see listed here on their webpage. One project that they're working on is mapping the stress of medical visits. They measured participants' skin conductance when they used various medical devices or visited hospitals to note when stress occurs, and then prototype possible solutions and record their effect. Now here's a video clip made by the lab that outlines another one of their studies on stress recognition.
in a biofeedback sort of way. That, you know, identifying anxiety before a person is even aware of the anxiety. I don't know if that's very good though, because if you have anxiety but you're not aware of it, then it's not very harmful to you. You know, it's not impacting you too much. So I wonder if that would actually make people overly sensitive to bodily changes that might reflect emotions that would have just been fleeting had they not been sensitized to them.
I think that the discipline directly below your own, in terms of the hierarchy of the sciences, which is physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, the social sciences, the discipline directly below your own is the one that you really need to have a very good foundation, because it's from that your discipline has its foundation. I think there's two areas of psychology that offer a very lot of prospects for significant advancements, and that's neuroscience. How does the brain work? And a more full understanding of our evolutionary psychology as to why the brain works like that. And those two should complement each other. If evolutionary psychology suggests that we've evolved this particular mental faculty or predisposition, eventually that should map onto the brain somehow.
I think about how much we know about human behavior just from the advent of some of the brain imaging technologies, information that we didn't have just a few decades ago has really led to changes in the way we think about some brain processing, etc.
In 2013, Obama announced the BRAIN Initiative, the 10-year scientific project to learn more about the workings of the human brain. Researchers will categorize brain cells based on 4 traits: shape, position, electrical activity, and gene expression. So far, they have many high-resolution photos of neurons taken while they are stimulated with electricity using a light microscope, while also noting the position within the cortex. And then for gene expression, the researchers will sequence each individual cell's RNA and look for overlap among those 4 traits.
Right now, with fMRIs, you can get a picture on a screen that is basically what the person is seeing, so you can see what they're seeing. I mean, qualia, the subjective experience, are ultimately private, but if the person says, yeah, that's exactly what I'm seeing on the screen, which they've recreated from the fMRI, that's pretty scary. And we can also read minds. We know what somebody's thinking about. If you ask somebody to think about a hammer versus a screwdriver, the fMRI can tell which one you're thinking about. And some of the current concerns is that if you can somehow remotely pick up, you know, EKGs through some device, I mean, you could literally know what people are thinking about. Our thoughts would no longer be private, which is that's a whole new world of bizarreness.
It's an ethical issue. In collecting this data, if you're collecting tons of data from people, you may be collecting information that you didn't expect to get, and it may be information that you need to make a decision about whether you need to act on it or not. So God forbid you're collecting data off somebody's phone and they indicate that they are feeling very depressed and there are indications of suicidality. What do you as a researcher do with that? Do you as a researcher even see it? You might not see it for another year until you're analyzing the data. And so this, you know, this leads to some other ethical questions too.
My concern is that they're getting so sophisticated, they can be used for good and bad. Like any powerful tool, it can be used for good or evil. We've already seen the possibility that Facebook data was used to perhaps throw a presidential election or change it what it would have been otherwise. the United States government, a former CIA officer or director, I saw on television, who basically admitted that the United States government has used social media and other technologies to throw elections in other countries. We're entering a new theater of warfare. It's not in your face with knives and swords or guns or artillery. It's to capture the minds of people. And that's an entire new theater that we haven't really, most people aren't aware of, and it's so subtle that it can influence us without us being aware of it. So essentially we're entering a new world, and very good can come of it, or very bad.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though. We don't mess around in other people's elections, Jim.
Only for a very good cause.
Can you do that? Do a Vine video on a former CIA director.
Only for a very good cause in the interests of democracy.
All right, thanks for being here. It's always great.
One of my concerns, of course, is sustainability. If there's one thing that corporations want us to do, is to consume more. And the more tools they have, psychological methods to get us to consume more, to buy their products, the more they will do so, and the more the problems of sustainability will become more difficult and intractable. And then there's the government, which we have if they can use psychological tools against their populace to get them to conform or whatever, we're talking about fascism again. In the short term, I think they're a good thing. In the long term, quite frankly, I fear them. I fear that psychological research will be, in some ways, used against us in ways that we've not consented to. We're not even aware of it's being used. And it can be used to achieve political ends or economic ends.
I do. I think as a whole they are, as long as we realize the limitations. As long as we don't apply them willy-nilly and in a way that we're blind to the limitations. I think they allow us to replicate scenarios, for example, in VR, that would be hard to create in real life. They allow us to allow us to collect a lot of information that would be difficult to collect without the technologies. So I think they give us a lot of information, and I think as long as we are cognizant of the limitations of the technologies, then they bring a lot of benefit.